New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Emmy Vadnais, co-host with Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is psychedelics and the cosmic mind with my guest, Chris Bache, who is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Youngstown State University in Ohio, where he taught for 33 years. He is also adjunct faculty at the California Institute of Integral Studies, Emeritus Fellow at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and on the Advisory Council of Groff Legacy Training. Chris is author of 4 books: Life Cycles, Reincarnation and the Web of Life, Dark Night, Early Dawn, The Living Classroom, Teaching and Collective Consciousness, and LSD and the Mind of the Universe, Diamonds from Heaven. If you enjoy this program, please like, subscribe, press the bell icon, and share. Chris is joining us from just north of Asheville in Weaverville, North Carolina. Now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Chris. It's a great joy to have you with me on New Thinking Aloud today.
Thank you, Emmy. It's a pleasure to be here.
Today, we're going to discuss your deep exploration of yourself, your own spiritual journey, and into the cosmic mind. When you had 73 LSD sessions between the years of 1979 to 1999, and you outline that in your book, LSD and the Mind of the Universe. Before we get into all that you experienced and what you gleaned and learned from from those sessions, can we just begin with talking a little bit about what you've noticed in the last, 10 plus years or more, where it seems that the taboo related to psychedelics seems to be shifting, the types of psychedelics there are out there, and what their uses are for, not each one, but sort of overall, why people do this. And today we're going to focus on specifically the cosmic exploration of them.
Well, as you know, there is a worldwide renaissance of research taking place in psychedelics. At the forefront of that research is the focus on therapeutic healing. That's what's bringing psychedelics back into the intellectual and clinical community. The capacity of these amplifying substances to bring forward the personal unconscious and to unearth the wounds of the personal unconscious and to assist and deepen, accelerate people's healings of trauma, various issues, post-traumatic stress, depression, things like this. A second use of psychedelics, overlapping but different from therapeutic healing, is using psychedelics to promote spiritual awakening, an awakening to the true nature, our deeper nature underneath our personality nature, to deepen our understanding, our experience of the wisdom of the universe, the intelligence of the universe, the consciousness of the universe. Classic kind of spiritual awakening to the nature of spiritual reality. And that's why I got started in this work, really was to deepen my spiritual awakening. But the protocol that I ended up using was so strong and so evocative. Within a few years, I was having experiences that went far beyond anything that could be understood in terms of either therapeutic healing or spiritual awakening. And I came to understand over time that the project that I was involved in was cosmological exploration. That is, a systematic attempt to explore the deep structure of spiritual reality or the deep structure of the consciousness of the universe itself. So that's really what my work is about. I'm not a clinician. I am trained as a philosopher of religion. What interested me from Stan Grof's early work was the capacity of these substances to lay bare not only the personal issues, but to enter into deep communion with the consciousness that lies behind existence.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us an overview of the different types of psychedelics, just to kind of list them off, of course, because there are many, but we're going to primarily talk about your experience with LSD today.
Many psychedelics. I mean, I guess the primary ones that come to mind are LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, though that's an empathogen more than a straight psychedelic, 5-MeO-DMT, Salvia divinorum, San Pedro. I mean, I think these are the types of psychedelics that most people are familiar with. There are all sorts of derivatives. MDMA, they're derivatives off of each of these little tweaks along the way. Yeah.
And we also want to say up front that you're not recommending necessarily that people engage in the same process you engaged in or advocating necessarily for the use of these per se. Is that right?
Absolutely. There are a large percentage of the population who shouldn't be doing psychedelics at all. These are very powerful amplifiers of consciousness. They have tremendous evocative potential. And there are persons who should not be venturing into these waters, and no one should be venturing into these waters without really good, high-quality professional guides accompanying you to keep you safe as you enter into this territory. Now, the protocol that I chose to work with was high doses of LSD. I worked at 500 to 600 micrograms. And looking back at it, at the end of it, I think, what was I thinking? That was ridiculous. But I had a deep hunger to explore the nature of existence, and working at these high doses took me on an adventure of a lifetime. But this is very demanding work, which requires a lot of concentration, a lot of safeguards, and a lot of time to assimilate the experiences. And I really, knowing what I know now, at the end of this journey, I strongly recommend against using the protocol that I used. If I were doing it over again, I would work with lower doses of psychedelics. I'd be much gentler on myself. I'd be willing to sort of peel back the layers of the psyche much more gradually than I did in this work.
So to begin into your journey, what was the impetus for you to embark on this deep exploration with high doses of LSD?
Well, I had just finished my graduate work. I had just started my academic career. At the time, I was a pretty convinced atheistically inclined agnostic. And then I met the work of two people, Ian Stevenson, whose work on reincarnation convinced me that reincarnation was a simple fact of life. And the other one was Stanislav Grof. And I read his book, Realms of the Human Unconscious, and I read it in 1978, 2 years after it had just come out. And as soon as I read that book, I recognized that Stan's work had tremendous significance, not only for psychotherapy, but it had tremendous significance for philosophy of religion, philosophy of consciousness. And I knew that if I was ever going to make a contribution in this field, I had to undergo my own therapeutic exploration, my own regimen. So very uncomfortably, I made a decision to break the law in a very, I hope, disciplined and restrained way. And I began a series of psychedelic sessions, which ended up, much to my surprise, ended up lasting 20 years. I worked for 4 years. I stopped for 6 years. And then I worked for another 10 years, finishing in 1999. And then I spent 20 years after that digesting these experiences, analyzing them, sifting them, sorting them, and then wrote LSD in the Mind of the Universe in 2019, 20 years after I had stopped my sessions.
Can you give us a sense of what your sessions were like, how you began? You mentioned that you had a sitter, somebody with you in that process. How did you choose to set up your set and setting?
Well, basically, I followed the protocol established by Stan, reflected in his book, Realms of the Human Unconscious, and then clarified further in his book, LSD Psychotherapy, where he lays out all the nuts and bolts of working in this modality. Mm-hmm. I was always in a room, separated from the world, protected from the world, no interruptions, by myself with my sitter, who was my wife at the time, who's a clinical psychologist who studied the psychedelic literature with me. I'm lying down. I'm using eye shades and headphones, conventional kind of classic psychedelic, deep introspection, deep meditative orientation, very carefully curated music to support the opening and the peaking and the closing of a session. So the basic idea is to profoundly energize the unconscious, and then to create an environment where the energies rising through your unconscious can be engaged cleanly and clearly. If you stay in contact with the physical world, if you're in dialogue with friends, or if you're going to a concert, that's all fine and good, but that's just not what this work is about. It requires a powerful amplification of the unconscious, but then creating a very carefully controlled environment that allows you to engage what rises conscientiously, and most importantly, to follow whatever arises to its very bottom level, to the bottom line, to let it take you wherever it wants to take you.
If I recall correctly, it was typically on Saturdays, because you had a very important day job teaching at a university. And I think your sessions lasted about, was it 8 hours each, roughly?
Yeah, pretty much. I would start in the early morning and I would finish by nighttime that night, a late afternoon, nighttime. So a session would last 8, 10 hours or so with a carryover tail, but basically a good hard 8 hours each session. So it's a major commitment. Eventually I developed spiritual protocols that I would adopt in the weeks leading up to a session and in the weeks after a session, and particularly the day or two before a session and the day or two after the session. You really have to work with that time and with the energy that is stirred in you, because if you're working with very high doses of a powerful psychedelic like LSD, it taps into very deep levels of the universe, and it takes your body and mind and subtle energy system a time to process that material. And so it's a major time commitment. It's just not the day of. It's several days before and several days after.
You also took meticulous notes from your sessions as well, which is a lot of what's in your book.
Yeah, that's the first step of integration, is to create an accurate phenomenological description of exactly what happens in your sessions. Because integration is the foundation of your future sessions. If you don't integrate your sessions thoroughly and conscientiously, then you're not going to have likely to have as deep an experience the next session out. So there's a circle where you open, but then you integrate what you experience, which lays the foundation for the deeper opening in your next session.
Yeah, it seems like they built upon each other.
In my experience, they did. Again, I kind of standardized my sessions as much as possible, eliminating as many variables. I always was using the same substance, the same dose, the same set and setting, the same sitter, even in the same part of the country. If you change those variables, it changes the subtlety of the interface between your mind and the universe's mind that you're engaging. So by trying to standardize those variables, you create an environment of sustained communion or dialogue with this deeper consciousness. And by creating that sustained, clear contact point, my experience was that the universe or the consciousness, whatever it was that I was engaging, that consciousness took me deeper and deeper in a systematic fashion. It was like taking a series of graduate courses in consciousness. It was a tremendous, rigorous, systematic expansion of my frame of reality.
Yeah. Why did you choose this path versus, for example, sitting in meditation or some other spiritual path that can lead you deeper into these realms?
Well, I had been meditating since college. I was familiar with meditation. I'd meditated in a couple of different traditions by that time. And I'm a professor of religious studies, so I had a good solid grounding in the world's spiritual traditions. I taught courses in psychology of religion and transpersonal studies and comparative mysticism. So I understood the world of meditation and contemplative practice. I started by thinking that these sessions would basically help me break through some of the obstacles that had risen in my contemplative practice. What I found, however, was that this was a protocol of spiritual exploration that took me deeper than I had ever imagined being possible when I began this work. And once I was into it a couple of years, I had developed an aptitude for working in these states. And I never stopped meditating. I was always meditating through this time. I was always doing yoga and various spiritual practices. In fact, I think that the deeper you want to go in working with psychedelics, the more important it is to have a daily spiritual practice that helps anchor you and helps you absorb the experiences that you unleash with psychedelics. It was a different protocol. It gave me access to states of consciousness that you can reach with meditation, but only with lifetimes, not just one lifetime, but many lifetimes of meditation. So I differentiate between what I call the path of temporary immersion, which is working with psychedelics, as you're only immersed in these states for hours at a time, versus the path of presence, of contemplative presence, where it's a slower path, but it tends to produce states of abiding transparency, whereas the temporary path pushes you deep into these conscious domains, and then it wears off and you come back. They're complementing approaches, but they are different.
Let's begin with your very first session, just to get us started, because I know you've done many of them, to give the listeners, the audience, the viewers, a taste of what your experience was like that led you to keep wanting to come back for more.
Probably the most significant thing that happened in my first session was that I entered a phase of the work where I could not remember who I was. I could not remember what I was, what I did for a living. I could not remember whether I was a man or a woman even. It was a complete interruption of my stream of consciousness that was telling me who and what I was. And this was a frightening experience, a jarring experience. But in the end, I learned that it was a very helpful experience because it showed me that it would be pointless for me to try to stay in control. Because if you can't control your self-knowledge, then that's about as basic as you can get. And this session taught me that in this work, you have to surrender radically to whatever arises. And it saved me a lot of time and energy later when more demanding experiences opened. There's a tendency to sort of want to maintain control, to hold on to reality as you know it. And in this type of work, you have to let go of reality as you know it. Mm-hmm. You have to completely surrender and go where it wants to take you. And so that was just the first lesson that basically said, don't waste time trying to maintain control.
Before we go further into some of your sessions and giving us a taste of your experiences and what you learned. Have you come to understand the physiology of what LSD is doing on the human physiology, the nervous system? Of course, a lot of people think about connect consciousness with the brain, which of course it's more than that. However, I recently spoke with Jill Bolte Taylor, who is a neuroanatomist from Harvard, and she had wrote a well-known book, Her Stroke of Insight, where she had a stroke, and she had an 8-year journey of recovery back, but she described that our personal sense of identity is just the size of a peanut in our brains.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I follow the discussion of the scientist about what is the biochemistry of LSD and how it affects brain structure and default mode network interruption and those type of discussions. But I'm not really drawn to that conversation. I'm not primarily a scientist in training. I basically have taken more of a psychological approach to understanding that these substances, whatever their mechanism, they amplify consciousness. They hypersensitize consciousness, and they allow you to experience dimensions of your mind and eventually of reality beyond your mind, which usually were kept in a space-time kind of focus where we don't experience these subtler textures.
Right. Where we can feel trapped inside our bodies or in what most people consider is primarily the materialistic world, which we know there's much more than that, which is what we're talking about today.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the real draw to me. And so I basically work within the frame of reference that I had acquired from Stan Grof and some of the other earlier researchers, using a description of the dynamic qualities of psychedelic consciousness, or the consciousness that arises with psychedelics. And I'll let the science guys sort out the physiology of it. I know that that's interesting. And I find that often the physiological discussion is carried out within reductive metaphysical assumptions, which really is not helping our conversation right now.
Mm-hmm. You mean the conversation in general? We're having a good conversation, right?
I mean, particularly the attempts to sort of understand, to correlate what's happening in the brain physiologically with the states of consciousness that one is experiencing. But often these discussions take place within a certain set of metaphysical assumptions. And too often those metaphysical assumptions tend to be reductive. They tend to sort of lean in the direction of thinking that physical reality is the dominant and determining reality of one's experience. But when you actually look at the experiences that emerge in psychedelics, that restrictive metaphysical framework is shattered.
Yeah. Well, I just want to touch on it for now, and primarily because there may be those listening thinking, well, this is just, your brain on drugs and it's causing, the whole chemical reaction.
Yeah.
That's been discussed with near-death experiencers and so forth, but research has shown that there's more going on with that. So I definitely understand what you're saying, and we can get into the veracity or the trusting of these experiences a little later in our conversation.
Yeah.
Can you take us more into some of your experiences with your sessions with LSD to give us a taste of what that was like for you?
Ooh, that's a hard question. Let's give a context. Some very influential books were written based on a very limited number of psychedelic experiences. So Aldous Huxley wrote his very important, beautiful book, Opening the Doors of Perception, after only one mescaline experience. And Houston Smith wrote his book, his collected reflections on psychedelics, Cleansing the Doors of Perception, after only taking LSD 6 times over the course of his lifetime. Michael Pollan wrote his book, which is a very important, very helpful book, but after only a handful of psychedelic experiences. So the challenge that anyone faces coming into my work, or the challenge that I have conveying my experiences, is just how long the journey was, how many layers of consciousness opened in that journey. It's not simply a matter of opening 73 times to the same interface. Is that there is a cycle of death and rebirth that reproduces itself so that death breaks you free of one level of reality, physical reality in the beginning, and takes you into a non-physical spiritual reality. And you work there for a while. But if you work consistently, eventually you'll go through another death and rebirth that will take you into another level of reality where you have to learn the whole rules of that level of reality, which then will be followed taking you into another level. So the problem I have with answering your question is so many levels of reality. If I focused on any one, I'd be leaving out so many others. So let me just say this in the beginning. When I was looking over the whole of my sessions and putting them together in order to write this storyline of what happened on those sessions, I eventually differentiated or distinguished 5 different broad categories that my sessions fell into. First, having to do with personal mind, your personal unconscious, your personal story. Second, collective mind, which has to do with the collective psyche, the psyche of humanity, the species mind. The third, archetypal mind, which in my case, I'm primarily addressing not archetypes in the Jungian sense, but archetypes more in the Platonic sense, levels, dimensions of reality which lie outside time and space and outside the collective psyche. Causal levels of reality are the level of oneness, the level where oneness becomes the dominant reality. And then beyond that, diamond luminosity, a particularly clear dimension of light that I encountered and worked with in the last 5 years of my work. So all of my experiences, I can kind of lay them out as a sequential journey, starting at the level of personal mind, moving into the level of collective mind, archetypal mind, so on and so forth.
Well, I would love to discuss each of those levels you went into. What I recall reading in your book that seemed to be common themes of your sessions were that it was, like you said earlier, a letting go, and that it seemed a lot of pain and suffering to actually reach to these deeper levels of consciousness. Can you share what that was like for you?
In the early stage, and when I was working at the level of personal mind, that the pain and suffering came in the form of what Stan Grof has very well discussed and presented in his discussion of the perinatal level of consciousness. Basically, sometimes reliving your birth, but confronting the fundamental existential questions that dominate life and physical reality. Is there any meaning in the universe? Is there any order, any design to it, any intelligence of it? Because at just the physical level, everything we love, everything we know will be destroyed at death. Is there any reality beyond death? I mean, and therefore you have to face the deepest levels of metaphysical angst in order to move through this until eventually your identity is just crushed and shattered. That's easier for some people to undergo than it is for other people, but you have to surrender your time-space identity in order to gain access to the next level of reality. At that next level of reality, I continue to have a deepening confrontation with pain, suffering, and violence. It was so deep and it lasted so long, and it seemed to encompass so many hundreds of thousands of persons in so many thousands of years that I eventually came to the decision that this was didn't represent a deepening or cleansing or healing of my personal psyche, that what was being healed here was some aspect of the collective psyche of humanity itself, that something was using my sessions in order to set in motion a reconciliation and a healing of levels of pain that were fundamentally collective, not personal. And then more levels of death and rebirth where the nature of death and suffering changes the deeper you go. But the basic principle is pretty simple. If you want to experience oneness with God, or if you want to experience a deep experience of the nature of the mind of the universe, the problem is our historical consciousness is just too small. If you want to literally experience it, I mean, it's one thing to think about it, but to actually immerse yourself in the communion with these levels of reality, your small identity has to be surrendered, and you have to be willing to flow into a larger level of identity. So eventually you're going into levels of reality where it would be a misrepresentation to think that Chris Bache went and had those experiences. Rather, Chris Bache has to be dissolved, in order for these levels of consciousness to manifest inside Chris Bache's awareness. But the fact that I remember those experiences doesn't mean that my personality identity was present when those experiences were being had. It's kind of like you have to lose yourself, enter into communion with the universe, and then when you come back, you gather your experiences back, and then my personality synthesizes them, digests them, trying to integrate them. But it's a pulsing. You learn to sort of surrender completely, open, breathe deeply, you receive teachings, then you bring it all back in, and then you try to integrate it and consolidate it.
What are some of the teachings you received?
That the universe is a manifestation of a single consciousness, a massive consciousness beyond anything that we've ever begun to grasp in our Western religious and philosophical traditions, that it is that creation is an intentional act. It is an act of, I hate to use the word design because those theories are problematic, but that there is an intelligence manifesting itself in time and space, that we are part of this intelligence, that our nature is of the same nature as its nature. So this is an ancient idea. Atman is Brahman. The essence of the individual is the essence of the totality. That reincarnation is simply a fact of life. I don't think we get anywhere in trying to understand existence unless we understand the pulse of life, unless we understand that our current life is just the most recent in many, many repeating cycles of life and death. That there is an underlying logic to the circumstances within which we find ourselves. The Buddhists and the Hindus talk about karma, that there is a deeper intentionality working itself out in the circumstances of our existence. And that our evolutionary existence is not simply driven by blind chance and mechanical processes, which are purely mechanical, but that there is a deeper intelligence manifesting itself in the circumstances of our life, in the challenges that we are facing, and inviting us to become more by the end of our life than we were in the beginning. So just a few touch points.
Yeah. Going back to your experiences in these sessions, it seems that death and rebirth and a purification process happened in many, if not all, of your sessions.
Yeah.
What did you come to understand was the reason for that?
First, the general structure of the sessions as I experience them is that every session there's a sort of a rhythm of a cycle with variations, but basically the first early hours of a session are spent in some type of deep purification process, deep confrontation. And then if you surrender to that process and let it take you, it reaches a culmination point. There is a surrender, a death rebirth process in which you are then spun into transpersonal ecstatic places for the remainder of the session. And then that runs its course. And then the next session, however many months between, and I was doing about 5 sessions a year on average, starts you right back into the purification part, carrying you then forward into the ecstatic portion. So the purpose of the purification and the purpose of the death is simply cleaning, just cleaning. when you eventually come to have deep experience of the fundamental identity of your nature and the divine nature, or the infinite nature, that you are the infinite, then it gives you a different perspective on what it is that was preventing you all those years from realizing that. What was keeping you from it? And it's this tight conditioning of the psyche. It's the type conditioning which is associated with your time-space consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And that has to be softened. It has to be released. It has to be let go in order to move into these expansive places. So the death rebirth cycle is actually a purification cycle. In fact, I learned that death is actually an intense stage of purification. Once you've died many times, you learn that truly it's impossible to die. You know, what you are can die. The structure of your life can die. Reality as you have known it can die. But the phoenix always rises. The essence of the person always emerges in a different reality with new potentials, with new capacities, but it's impossible to die. And the reason we can't die is, I think, because our nature is the nature of the divine. So the form can die, but the essence cannot die. Once you know that, then I began to understand that the experience of death, which kept coming up in my sessions, was actually an advanced experience of purification. When purification reaches a critical position, so that it begins to dissolve the fundamental structures of what you had known as real, then you have reached the death point, the death and rebirth point. And death has come back to grace you again. So from my perspective, experiencing death in a psychedelic session, or to experience horrendous suffering or pain, is actually it's an exciting stage in the work. It's not something to be avoided. A lot of people worry about, oh, I don't want to have a bad session. We got to do everything we can to avoid having a bad session. But I think that's a radical misunderstanding of the depth of consciousness and the power that this technique gives you.
Mm-hmm.
In my experience, you begin to understand that the deeper the purification, the deeper the ecstatic immersion. So that you begin to welcome the purification, you begin to welcome the challenges that you face, you begin to welcome the bad sessions in order to actualize a higher, more intimate experience with the divine consciousness. Now, that's assuming that you're working in a completely controlled environment, you have done all the homework, you've done your preparation. You can have a bad session for a lot of bad reasons. You can be in the wrong place, the wrong time, not preparing yourself, wrong set and setting. Those can give you bad sessions, which are not of the quality that I'm talking about.
Yeah, I will share that when I was in high school, a group of friends wanted to do LSD or acid, as it was called, as well. And I did not partake. However, I was the sitter. And my role was to make sure that everybody did have a good experience, which actually, the few times that happened was always the case. But I know you mentioned that a bad trip is not necessarily a bad trip.
Yeah.
So you suggest that that's part of the process, but one needs to have done the preparation ahead of time to know what they're getting into.
Yeah, I mean, psychedelics amplify consciousness, and most people will take I don't want to overgeneralize. Some people take a psychedelic, and what they're looking for is a good afternoon, a little more openness to the life of the universe, a little more openness to the love that's in the universe, and they maintain the fundamental parameters of their personality get softer and expansive, and let some of these experiences in, which is perfectly fine. But if you want to go into a deep dive, if you want to explore the deep structure of existence, if you want to transcend space, transcend time, move into the deep future, that requires a more carefully laid out strategy in working with these states. So I'm not suggesting that the way I work with these states is the only way, beneficial way to work with these states. It's simply, for me, as a philosopher, I was looking for depth of immersion, depth of understanding, and that takes some serious work.
Mm-hmm. So while we're on the topic of this death and rebirth, surrendering, purification, can you share with us what is it that dies and reborn? I know you outline in your book a few different areas that you've come to understand.
Yeah. Well, basically, this became a real intellectual issue for me. I mean, when you experience dying and being reborn through multiple levels of reality, it then becomes a question, what is it that's actually dying? You may have deep and profound experiences of dying years after you've gone through ego death. And it's not simply the ego dying over and over and over again. It's a different kind of death. So at the appendix in LSD and the Mind of the Universe, I have an appendix on what dies and is reborn. And I suggest 4 levels of maybe beginning to address that question. One of them is what dies is our personal ego. Second is what dies is some aspect of the collective ego, of the collective psyche. Third, what dies is what I call the shamanic persona. Complicated concept, but when you've been on the journey for a long time, when you move into psychedelic space, you resume your psychedelic persona, you resume your shamanic persona. It's like, as a friend of mine said, you walk with the old ones once again. You've made the transition often enough that your shamanic persona is the living integration of all of your psychedelic experiences up to that point in time. So let's say, in this case, it was 20 sessions in, working at the level of the collective psyche into what I call the ocean of suffering. You stabilize a psychedelic identity, a shamanic persona that integrates all the experiences that you have had of transpersonal states of consciousness beyond your physical consciousness. If you are going to go into yet a still deeper level of consciousness beyond where you had lived before, then that shamanic persona has to die. It has to surrender in order for a new category, set of category of experiences to emerge, and for a still deeper shamanic persona to emerge. And so I think in some advanced sessions, what is dying is the previous identity or the identity which we had developed from sustained psychedelic experiences over many years. So that's, I think the third thing is I would suggest it's what I call the shamanic persona, or the shamanic self is dying. It's not the egoic self. It's your psychedelic self, which is dying. And then at a more subtle level, I think what is dying is actually some dimension of consciousness itself. And this gets harder to discuss because it requires a more subtle level of understanding. But basically, sometimes in my late work, when I was working at very deep levels of consciousness, when I was working in deep levels of divine communion, I had the experience that the divine level that I was experiencing came itself into a crescendo which opened up a higher level of divine communion than had been actualized up to this point in time. Sri Aurobindo says, when he's talking in his metaphysical system, he says, looking down, the divine sees all the levels of reality that it's manifested, but it's a one-way mirror. So the divine looking down sees everything. But we, who are the divine looking up, tend to see only the level that we are at. So it's a one-way mirror. And that means even at deep, deep levels, so we'd say there are aspects of divine consciousness which cannot see or experience into still deeper levels of divine consciousness. And somehow when we do this work, we actually can facilitate a communion which takes place between two different levels of divine consciousness, far beyond space-time, far beyond personal reality. And there is a celebratory joy that takes place when the divine wakes up to a still deeper level of the divine. There is a communion that takes place. There is a joyful celebration when the higher is able to infuse itself more deeply into the lower. And so I think that one way of thinking about what dies in very advanced stages is some aspect of divine consciousness itself.
And yet, according to your experiences, that death then precipitates a rebirth, typically. Did you discover that with consciousness itself as well?
Yes.
Or the divine itself?
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated because we're rushing into an area where angels fear to tread.
Right, we're trying to put language to an experience that sometimes, for example, with near-death experiencers, they'll say it's ineffable. So I understand there's a language barrier.
Well, there is a language barrier, but for me, the biggest issue is not the language barrier. It is to lay the foundation, to lay the prerequisites, to put things in place so that you people can understand the language that you want to use to describe these phenomena. And it's not ordinary day language. It's not everyday experience. It requires kind of a conceptual reframe, a conceptual understanding so that you can describe certain things that lie far beyond our ordinary sensate experience. But in some ways, it's not that different from what a near-death episode person experiences. In fact, I feel the greatest correspondence and collegiality with people who have had deep near-death episode experiences, because deep NDEs are the closest correlate to my experience with deep psychedelic work. I think if you work with psychedelics in a focused way over long periods of time, you can access the same dimensions of consciousness that someone accesses with an NDE, a near-death experience. The difference is that where for most people, the NDEer experiences this only once in their life. With sustained psychedelics, you can go back multiple times into this territory. And because you can go back multiple times, you're taught there are more nuances that are brought out in terms of how this all works in the interplay of consciousness.
Can you help expand the conceptual framework for us a little bit about what that experience has been like for you?
Let me narrow it into one particular, just to take one example. When I was into the work now, I guess 4 or 5 years into the work, and I began to get systematic access to archetypal reality. And I began to have experiences every time I went into my session. I entered a level of reality that I knew was more real than space-time. It was the primary reality. Space-time was the secondary reality. I had encounters with vast beings that I could not comprehend. I could not wrap my mind around them. But I knew that these were the beings who were responsible for creating space-time and creating fundamental conditions within space-time. But to have access to these realities, everything that I had known about human history, about human thought, everything about the history of humanity had to fall away, because the entire collective psyche had to fall away in order to enter into levels of consciousness that humanity as a whole has not had access to or has not experienced. Very few number of people have access to these deep dimensions of reality.
Mm-hmm.
But even in archetypal reality, you're dealing with very profound levels of consciousness, but there is still dualism there. There is still a sense of self and other, archetype and self, different archetypes. So there is a dualistic quality to it. When I went beyond archetypal reality into causal reality, that's the signature of causal reality, that all dualisms dissolve, so that you begin to experience the world in whatever aspect you're experiencing it. You're experiencing the world as a unified single entity, a single consciousness. I think it was Plotinus who says, the world breathes as one. And that's the experience there, that there is a radical transparency that opens where you are fundamentally encountering the wholeness of life that doesn't negate differentiation. In fact, it affirms differentiation. But that differentiation is experienced as different manifestations of this single, integrated, whole, undivided reality that we call God, or we call the divine, or the one. That's a different category of experience altogether from archetypal reality.
Can you share a little bit more about why it's termed archetypal reality, or that layer, for those who maybe aren't familiar with archetypes?
Sure. I use the term archetype in sort of two senses here. One is Jung talked about archetypes as the primary themes, the repetitive themes of human experience that become concretized in forms: old man, old woman, trickster, jokester, those clacks of shadow. And then, so I think of them as kind of archetypal in the sense of the dominant themes of the collective psyche.
I see.
The second way in which archetypes is used is in the Platonic tradition, where Plato talks about the discovery of a level of reality that lies beyond time-space altogether. And I experience both. I experience Plato's sense of archetypes. I experience that reality, but not in the way that Plato describes it. Plato thinks of archetypes as eternal principles within an eternal being. So they are the unchanging prototypes that are used in creation, and they exist within the mind of an unchanging divine, unchanging infinite being. That's not how I experience those archetypes. I experience them as living entities, but living on a vast scale of time and space, far beyond anything that we know inside time and space. But what is shared is that for something to manifest inside time and space, it comes out of the oneness through these fundamental intermediate structures, which are very profound, super intelligent, super powerful structures, and then focusing this energy down into concretizing it into eventually manifesting in space-time reality as we know it.
Mm-hmm.
When I experience the collective psyche, and I experience a lower level of archetypes in Jung's sense of archetypes, it was similar to Jung's sense in that there were these archetypal themes within humanity, but I did not experience what Jung experienced as archetypes. I didn't have the experience of wise old man, wise old woman, things like this. It's not that I don't think those exist. But what I experienced was humanity as a single organism, over and over and over again, as a single organism, and that there were metameridians within humanity that wove all of our individual lives into the life of the human species as a whole. So I learned that our minds are woven into the collective mind. They are aspects, they are seed crystals within the collective mind. Even our bodies and the diseases that we have to manage are all part of the body of humanity evolving itself over long periods of time. So it was archetypal in the sense of trans-individual motifs within the human psyche, but it wasn't quite the way Jung conceptualized it. So basically, archetypes in this way reflect the insight that there are dominant structures that are suprapersonal. They go beyond the functioning of individual beings. And then in Platonic sense, there are metaphysical archetypes that basically inform the manifestation of time and space itself.
Mm-hmm. So at the causal level, you mentioned this is where you connect with the divine intelligence, or what we perceive as God. I imagine there may be people listening wondering, did you discover that there is a God?
I generally tend not to like to use God language, though I do. The reason I don't like to use God language is because, as someone who knows the history of world religions pretty well, I also know all the theologies that have gone into God language and all the cultural limitations that go into it and all the abuse that went into it and all the crimes and the horrible things that have been done in the name of God. And certainly, I'm not talking about God in anything like that. And so I would use the word the divine instead of God, but that's just an end run, because even the concept of the divine carries into it certain carryovers from our time-space experience. And so on the one hand, I want to affirm the idea that there is this profound generative intelligence manifesting as time and space, that time and space is not something which is independent of the divine, but it is, in classic Hindu thinking, it is the manifestation of the body of the divine. So in that way, I want to affirm a very wide vision of the divine, of God. But because I've gone so deeply into the future and so deeply beyond space and time so many times, my understanding or my feeling for this cosmic principle, I can't fit it inside the theologies of the religions of the world. It's much larger than that. And so on the one hand, okay, I can call it God, but then I have to qualify that it's not this, it's not that, it's not what you mean by God here, it's not what you mean by God there.
Right. Like a lot of people think of, at least in the monotheistic traditions, think of it as an individual or a being that we're made in the form of, right?
Yeah.
And that's what I think people are maybe curious about, is what you discovered as far as, did you connect with a being or beings or angels or other divine entities? And if you could share a little bit about what that realm was like.
In all the years when I was doing this work and all the work I did, I never encountered a being, a divine being said, I'm God, this is what I am. It wasn't like that. It was like I would go deeper into a level of consciousness and I would experience a communion with this consciousness. And this consciousness would teach me, it knew me, it would teach me and show me things, and it would crush me and then bring me forward into still deeper levels. And I would go into those deeper levels and I would enter into communion with those levels, and I internalized the energy of those levels. And I was with this consciousness, but it never crystallized into a specific form. I always felt its presence. It guided my sessions. I could enter into dialogue with it. I could enter into communion with it. It would dissolve me into itself, but it never crystallized into what you might call a personality of God or a person of God. And it just kept getting larger and larger, deeper and deeper, more and more vast. And I think that many of our theologies of God, or our thinking about God, is really based upon what I would call the early encounters with an infinite intelligence. That this infinite intelligence is far larger, far too large to ever be concretized in the historical lineages that we recognize in the world traditions. It's infinite in itself. In fact, when I was in the deepest level of consciousness that I ever went into, when I was in the Diamond Luminosity work, and that's the work that occupied me for the last 5 years, when I was as deep into the Diamond Luminosity as I had ever entered, and I was far beyond time-space reality, I was dissolved into the luminous, you might say, the body of the divine.
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden my visual field turned 90 degrees, a window opened up, and I saw reality far, far in the distance. And I saw a light in that reality, and a beam of light came out of that reality and hit me. And I was in the diamond luminosity condition. But this light was so powerful, it shattered my mind. And it took me minutes to recover from this. And that's when I began to realize it's an infinite progression. The divine is truly an infinite reality. Even using this powerful method, I would never get to the end of this reality. And that's one of the reasons why I would be much gentler with myself if I were doing this again today. Because I discovered, when I began this work, I thought that the purpose was to reach a state of consciousness, to reach enlightenment, or to reach oneness with God, or to dissolve into the primal void. And I had known oneness with God at many different levels, and I had entered into the primal void several times, and I had learned that there were different depths of the primal void. And so now I began to understand that it's not about getting to some end state which is going to magically transform your life. It's a matter of opening up and letting the love and intelligence of the universe or the divine into you, as much as you can bring it in, as much as you can hold on to it, as much as you can distill into the fabric of your living existence, your earthly existence. It's not about getting to some endpoint. It's about deepening the ongoing communion that exists between ourselves inside time and space and this larger spiritual reality.
Very beautiful. Can you share more with us about the diamond luminosity?
Light surfaces many times in our psychedelic work. I mean, every time you go through a death rebirth experience, very typically people encounter the light, many forms of light. And I had encountered this light at many different levels along the journey. After I'd gone through ego death, after I'd gone through the ocean of suffering work, after I'd gone through archetypal reality, after I'd gone into the causal level reality, about 15 years into my work, when I had been given so many spiritual treasures, I felt completely existentially satisfied. I mean, I had been to experience radical shunyata, emptiness of self, oneness of all existence, had been offered so many treasures. And then I went through yet another cycle of death and rebirth, and I accessed a level of light, a dimension of light that was so pure and so clear, it absolutely stunned me. And it became my sole objective in the rest of my psychedelic work to return to this reality. Because once you touch what I'm calling the diamond luminosity, once you touch it, it's a reality which is so far beyond anything that I had ever touched in any of my earlier work that I just lost interest in archetypal reality. I lost interest in causal reality. I wanted to get back into this level of reality. It's so pure. It's just breathtakingly, magnificently pure, and the levels of ecstasy associated with it are just staggering. And in the next 5 years of work, in 26 sessions, which is 1/3 of my entire journey, I only got access to this level of reality four times. So in between those 4 sessions were lots of purification, more purification at a very deep level, more learning, more teaching, but accessing this reality 4 times. And I think as I look at the world's literature, the spiritual literature, and Buddhist literature is probably the tradition that I know the best, they call this level of reality Dharmakaya, the clear light of absolute reality. So it is considered in their tradition the absolute foundational reality of time and space. All time and space reality, all the galaxies, all the Big Bang emerge out of this crystalline light, which is a pre-samsaric. It's what we would call an extra samsaric reality. It's outside of the cycle of space and time. So it's outside of physical reality, and it's also outside of the bardos of postmortem existence. It's outside of the entire system.
Mm-hmm.
Once you touch it, you're hopelessly in love with it for the rest of your life. It just is something that it illumines everything. I understood what the Buddhists meant when they said, touch it once, it can undo hundreds of years of living in the shadows of karma, because it has such a penetrating transformative impact that just to touch it, it changes your whole understanding of existence and your whole experience of what it means to be alive.
Mm-hmm. Is this also what you referred to in your book as the beloved?
Well, everybody has to find a word to describe this transcendent reality. We can talk about God, or
Mm-hmm.
we can talk about the divine. Some people call it the absolute. Taoism calls it the eternal Tao. Jewish mysticism calls it the Ein Sof, the great nothingness, the great emptiness. I call it my beloved, because when you, in a path of temporary immersion, you move into intimacy with this reality, and then you come back out of it. And then you move into intimacy and you come back out of it. And it becomes like a love relationship. But it's a love relationship which actually dissolves the bodies of the two different beings. The communion that arises it's a deep and profound spiritual communion. And so I just adopted the vocabulary that felt most natural to me, and I called it my beloved, the beloved. And so, yes, to me, the beloved manifests itself at all sorts of different levels. It's manifesting itself at the early level, early stages, at the middle stages, and the advanced stages. But in the end, you recognize that you're always in dialogue with this profound creative intelligence, which, interestingly enough, feels more like a she, in my experience, than a he. And I associate the feminine side of God with the act of creation, and what you might think of as the masculine side of God as the radically transcendent aspect of God. The basic idea is that the primal one divides into two. One stays outside of space-time, the other manifests space and time and manifests all life within space and time. So for me, the beloved is more the feminine side of the divine mother.
Yes, it seems that light is a theme in your experiences, and also how much of a role did or does love play in these experiences for you?
It played eventually a very large role. There were some sessions in which I encountered or was blessed with experiences of cosmic love. I mean, and it's love not like anything I'd ever experienced before. I mean, it just absolutely shatters me and overwhelmed me. I experienced that all of existence was generated not out of simply a sheer power. I mean, can you think of the power of the Big Bang and everything that emerged from it? Not only the intelligence there, but that love, a profound cosmic love, lies at the very act of creation itself. And that's obviously a kind of love that's not like anything that we know in human parlance. It's not anything nearly that small, but it is the fiber of the divine itself. And I think you can think of it as love and oneness are kind of two different sides of the reality, because love, if the world is truly one, if it's all one, love is the emotion of this oneness. Love is the fact of oneness asserting itself in a world of duality. Yeah, love has been really important, which it really surprised me because, of the 4 yogas in Hinduism, Jnana, the path of the mind, Raja, the path of meditation, Karma yoga, Bhakti yoga, Bhakti yoga, the yoga of loving devotion, is a form of yoga that I identified with the least. I've always been more intellectually oriented, meditatively oriented, not bhakti oriented. And yet I began to have a series of very profound bhakti experiences that it's kind of what led me to talk about the beloved in this very lover kind of context.
Mm-hmm. How much is love the fabric of the divine?
Anything I say at this point, first of all, please forgive my hubris at daring to describe the nature of the divine. I mean, come on, get real. I mean, this is just like, so anything I say is going to be totally inadequate to the reality itself. So we could describe the divine nature as infinite knowledge, infinite power, and infinite love. And all of those are equally true. And I'm sure that there are other qualities which we would want to add to that. But then let's start with those three. The challenge, I think, of understanding the love aspect of the divine is because life as we experience it is an often dirty, nasty, mean, cruel thing. And so any suggestion that somehow the world as we know it, with all of its pain and suffering, is somehow a manifestation of a supremely loving consciousness it's horrendously difficult to reconcile those. And I understand that. I mean, as a philosopher of religion, I understand the challenge. And I think the only way of overcoming that challenge is to really understand the deep structure or the deep intentionality that's manifesting itself in the creation itself, in our evolving universe, in the project of the universe. You have to radically expand your time horizon to understand what's taking place here. You have to understand that the human condition, as we currently know it, is just a small dot in a long developmental process that not only has been going on for 13.7 billion years, but will continue to go on for 13.7 plus more years. So that, as Sri Aurobindo said, we are a transitional species. We are actualizing ourselves within a long developmental trajectory. And if we think that, God must not be real because we could have done a better job creating a universe. If I had infinite power, I could have certainly created a better universe than this, where children die and all the terrible things that happen to us. But that assumes that we know what the divine intention is, what the project of existence is. And I think we are like children in a playpen. We are just beginning to get a grip on the enormity of the project of existence. We're just beginning, really since Hubble, in modern theories of cosmology, beginning to understand the size and depth and textures. I think psychedelics are kind of like the Hubble of psychological insight. They are giving us an experience of the depth in which consciousness exists. But that just gets us at the beginning to comprehend what is the project. What will humanity be 5 billion years from now? What will we be 1 million years from now, or even 100,000 years from now? The divine seems to think on that scale. We have to radically stretch ourselves to think on that scale. So the problem of suffering really challenges our understanding of the role of love, the principle of love in the divine nature. But once we have an experiential access to some of the deeper trajectories of the divine intent, then things begin to make more sense.
Mm-hmm.
I think the divine is creating a masterpiece. I mean, I think refined, elevated, potentiated human experience is a masterpiece of creation that takes thousands, millions of years, billions of years to orchestrate and to bring forward, especially since it's not done. We intentionally cooperate and participate in this creative process. It's not being done to us. It's something we are carrying forward in the very fiber of our being. But we really have to kind of grasp the scale of things to even understand our present circumstances.
At the same time, it sounds like you found that the Atman is Brahman, that you found that we are part of the divine and the divine is part of us.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that there's very little that's new in any of the experiences that I lay out. I mean, the vision of reality, the cosmology that emerges out of psychedelic work is fundamentally the same as the cosmology that emerges out of deep, mystical, spiritual traditions in the very highest and most refined levels of spiritual traditions in the world. It's not that we're bringing something new to the table, maybe a little bit, but we're not bringing a whole lot of new to the table. What we have is a different protocol, a different strategy for accessing these very deep levels of reality, which yield deep insights into the structure of existence. But you will find the same fundamental cosmology emerging out of the great spiritual traditions of the world.
Since you brought up the Hubble telescope, and we've primarily been talking about what we consider, it's just another word, as consciousness, what did you discover in our universe, what we consider as sort of the physical universe, what we consider as space or outer space? Did you traverse that aspect of experience in your sessions?
I wasn't taken into journeys into our galaxy or journeys into other galaxies. That just wasn't part of the work for me. Other people may have those experiences or have had those experiences. So while I was given, there's a particular session called the Cosmic Tour. I called it the Cosmic Tour, where I was taken on this cosmic tour and shown so many things, much of which I could not reproduce when I came back into my time-space consciousness, because my time-space consciousness just did not have the vocabulary, the intellectual tools to articulate those. And that's why I've often wished that I had a PhD in physics and astrophysics, that I would better be able to articulate some of the experiences that I was given. But I didn't spend a lot of time traveling within time and space. It was more a matter of going underneath time and space and getting into the underlying deep structure that informs time and space and our experience in time and space.
I feel like I recall in your book that you were shown that like the universe, I think you've kind of already said this, like goes on and on essentially. Is that right? Do I recall that correctly?
Yeah. I mean, basically there are two different models of the universe. One is that it'll keep expanding forever. And the other is that we reach a point where there's a maximum expansion, and then it begins a contraction. So is it a pulsating universe, expanding and contracting and then re-expanding? Or is it an infinitely expanding universe? I don't really have an answer to that particular question, but clearly the universe is it's on a tear.
Yeah.
It's on a tear. It's going on for billions and billions and billions of years.
Yeah.
Now that's a deflating insight if you think that a human being is simply a 100-year-old being. If we're simply a 100-year-old being, then we're basically sand on the beach beside the ocean. We don't really get to participate in that deep future. But if reincarnation is true, and I think there's plenty of factual evidence that it's true, if reincarnation is true, and if it's true that our essence is indestructible, and that we take everything that we've learned and roll it over into continued learning over thousands and thousands and millions of years, then we get to actually participate in this divine unfolding. It's not somebody else's future or some other future, but it's our future. We are co-participants, eternal participants in this eternal process.
Mm-hmm. In your experiences, you talked about the birth of the future human.
Yeah.
Can you shed a little light on what that is about?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a chapter in the book called The Birth of the Future Human. And I really think this is maybe the most important chapter of the book. And it's also the one that caught me completely by surprise. I wasn't expecting anything like this in my journey. I mean, I thought at first it was a personal journey about personal healing, personal awakening. Then when that expanded, I still thought, okay, it's a journey about an individual being given experiences that provide insight into the deep structure underlying our lives. But then about halfway through my work, starting in around 1990 and continuing through 1995, I began to be given a series of visions that were internally consistent, that were dropped into my sessions, talking about humanity's evolutionary destiny, where humanity was in its evolutionary journey, that we were coming into a turning point in history, that we were coming into a culmination of a crescendo of the evolutionary journey that was going to catalyze a transformation inside humanity that would mark a true before and after moment in time. There was a profound spiritual transformation that was coming to a crescendo, coming to a head. And this kept repeating itself in my work in different ways. But I did not know how the universe was ever going to pull this off. I didn't understand how it didn't show me how it was going to happen. And then about a year and a half later, when I was in the middle of the diamond luminosity work, so I was working at a very deep level, in one particular day, I was given an experience taken far into the future. I had died and dissolved into the human psyche. So when I say I was taken into the future, it's not so much that Chris Bache was taken into the future. It's like, as the human family, I experienced the human family in a trans-temporal dimension of time, in a time expanded state. And I experienced in an accelerated way the death and rebirth of the entire human family. I experienced a profound geopolitical crisis that seemed to be being seeded by a cascading series of ecological crises. But I experienced some type of fundamental loss of control, an unraveling of life at the basic level, a tremendous global crisis that was so deep and so profound that no one was going to be able to isolate themselves or protect themselves from it. It was a crisis so deep, it was going to bring humanity to our collective knees. But just when the crisis reached its peak, I experienced that we moved through it, and then there was the beginning of a lightning. We made it through this crisis. And when we began to pick ourselves up in this post-crisis period of history, we've discovered that we had been profoundly changed. Something happened in this crisis that opened us up, changed us at the very center of our being. One way of talking about it is that there was a birth of oneness, that oneness, instead of being a private mystical experience of a very select few, oneness was born within the human psyche as a whole. We tapped into a certain depth of our nature that allowed us to become, first of all, it allowed us to become no longer enemies with all other human beings. All the divisions of history that have been used to justify, differences of race, differences of class structure, difference of religion, all those differences which we think of and have used to divide history, national identity, all those were dissolved, all those were transcended, and we began to experience a fundamental oneness at the core of our life and all life itself. And this led to a creativity began to reinforce itself, and we began to create new social forms, new structures. And eventually, over time, I came to understand that what this was about was that there was a pressure building up within the collective psyche, and that this pressure was taking humanity through a collective death rebirth process that represented a fundamental, irreversible shift in the collective psyche. I think of it as the shift in the plate tectonics of the collective psyche, so that any child born after we make this transition will be operating within a psychic field which is fundamentally different, more elevated, more spiritually informed than we are operating out of now, or we've been operating out of the past. So that this isn't simply a crisis with economic ramifications or industrial ramifications or political or civic ramifications. It's a revolution in the fundamental structure of the human psyche. It's a revolution in our human nature. Now, I think that we have entered this period, this process. I think we're in the very early stages of it. We're just getting started on it. I think the 21st century will be pivotal in going through this transformative crisis. I wasn't given a lot of details on names, dates, and places and stuff like that. What I was given was this core experience of what it's going to feel like for the human family when they go through a collective dark night of the soul, go through a collective ordeal that eventually will awaken an underlying revolution in the human psyche, a spiritual opening of the human psyche. Now, I'm not alone. This is nothing, unique to me. I mean, this is an insight that many spiritual teachers have had, many indigenous people have had, many psychedelicists have tapped into this understanding. And I think this is the flow of history underneath us that we can tap into in different ways. I think many of the spiritual, mystical traditions have tapped into and have begun to understand some of this dynamic. But I think we're coming into a century where we are at a critical turning point.
Mm-hmm.
I really believe that the 21st century is pivotal here, because if we just look at the scientific data on the ecological crisis, if we look at what is now an increasingly shared understanding of the depth of ecological disruption that we're going into, and the change of interrupting. Well, I won't go into the scientific material, but clearly we cannot continue on Earth operating the way that we have been operating in the past. We don't have enough resources. The inequality is just too extreme. I don't think we can continue to govern the Earth or out of the psychological structure of the ego. The ego is fundamentally a divided psychic structure. And I think the ego is a beautiful thing. It's a magnificent thing, but it fundamentally is cut off from the core of existence, the foundation of existence, and each other. We need to evolve into a higher level of consciousness, which is post-egoic, in order to have the wisdom to rise to the challenges that the ego has created for humanity over its last multi-thousand year history. And I think we will. I think we will come through this crisis. I think we're going to go through unbelievable suffering in the centuries ahead. But I do believe that we come through it, because at least that's been the nature of my experience. We do come through this, and humanity does make this evolutionary pivot.
Well, I know there's more you can share about this topic, and I think we'll do a whole other conversation about the birth of a future human, and also we want to talk more about reincarnation.
Yeah.
Can you share why you stopped these LSD sessions in 1999?
Well, I talk about this in the book in the last chapter, Coming Off the Mountain. And I basically boil it down to two reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Pain and heartache. my subtle energy system, psychedelic states open you up to huge flows of energy. You're taking in enormous flows of energy. It takes years and years to manage the flows of energy. And I basically realized that I was running so hot that even months after my session was over, I was still running. I was permanently uncomfortable in my body because of the quantity of energy that was running in my subtle energy system, my chi system, or my prana. So that was telling me that it was time to let my body calm down and let that subtle energy system find a new equilibrium point. But the main reason I stopped was because of heartache. Because once you dissolve into the divine light, once you dissolve into diamond luminosity and dissolve into the crystalline nature of consciousness at this very, very deep level, coming back into time and space is just difficult. It's very hard. You lose your zest for living inside time and space when you know how much more is available to you outside of time and space. And going into and coming out of and going into and coming out of this became too painful.
Mm-hmm.
And so eventually my beloved and I came to an agreement that I would not return to these states of consciousness until I could stay with her forever. And that's really what lies behind my stopping. I just had to stop and for the rest of my life focus on internalizing the gifts that I had already been given, rather than trying to acquire or be given more gifts.
You've been in communication with Stanislav Grof and Ralph Metzner, who are pioneers in this area of psychedelics and psychological consciousness, cosmic exploration.
Mm-hmm.
Have you shared your experiences with them, and what have they shared with you about that?
I've been in dialogue with both of them, and I have shared my sessions with Stan, and he quotes from some of my sessions scattered throughout his books. Some of them are anonymous, and in some of the later works, they're identified as mine. And Stan very graciously wrote a beautiful foreword to my book, Dark Night, Early Dawn, which was my first major book on psychedelic work, psychedelic theory. I think that there's a fundamental, we have different projects, different agendas. Stan is a therapist. He's a world healer. He has worked with thousands of individuals and collected thousands and thousands of session experiences and organized them into an understanding of the vast scope of the landscape that one experiences in these states. My work has been different. I've really been doing an individual journey, penetrating deeper and deeper and deeper into the universe. So I see our work as complementary in that way. But yeah, I've been in dialogue with both of them. Yeah, I love them both very dearly. Ralph has now transitioned on. I love them dearly. We've been in dialogue. Ralph gave me feedback on LSD and the Mind of the Universe before I published it. So yeah, I consider them close colleagues and good friends.
So they were supportive of your process?
Yes. Yeah.
That's wonderful. The last area I want to touch on with you is that, of course, people listening, some may think, well, how much can we trust these experiences? And I know that you had a conversation or an interaction with Kenneth Ring, who is the co-founder of the International Association for Near-Death Studies.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could share a little bit about your correspondence with him, or what you have to say about how much we can trust your experiences.
Yeah, that's a really important question. How do we know that we aren't simply exploring some hidden corner of my personal unconscious, or even some hidden corner of the collective psyche? I understand how radical the assertions are that I'm making them sound almost cavalier. But how do we know that we can trust these experiences to be what I'm suggesting that they are? And Ken Ring and I had a dialogue about this. Ken is a wonderful scholar, and he's a good friend. And so after he had read LSD and the Mind of the Universe, he wrote me, and we went back and forth around precisely this issue. How trustable are these deep psychedelic experiences? How do we know that they're not better understood as a manifestation of something coming out of the personal psyche or the collective psyche, that they really have these metaphysical, ontological ramifications that I've been interpreting them to have? And so he and I went back and forth in an exchange of letters about this. And Ken worked me over pretty hard. I mean, he was asking hard questions, and I loved it. And eventually we decided that this was a dialogue that was worth sharing. So we wrote it up in an essay called Are Deep Psychedelic Experiences Trustable? And we published it online, and it's available. If you just Google that title, you'll find it. Mm-hmm. And in it, I try to address that specific issue. And I also bring in other people's experiences, which provide levels of objective verification, because many psychedelic experiences lead us to have experiences that can be verified because they relate to something inside time and space. The deeper cosmological experiences cannot be verified in that way. But the existence of verifiable experiences, when they refer to time-space reality, certainly points to the credibility of the deeper cosmological experiences. So I bring in a lot of evidence in the footnotes and in the literature that speak to the issue of the trustability of these experiences. I think most of our doubt about their trustability is completely understandable, but I think it comes from, first, not having personal experience of these states and trying to understand them within a metaphysical framework that's based upon time, a physical sensation experience, mental experience, sensate experience. We're trying to understand these things within a framework which is smaller than they need to be. It's just like, we had to have tens of thousands of near-death episodes in print and published before the medical community began to take them seriously, because they didn't want to interpret these as an indication of the existence of spiritual reality. They wanted to interpret it as something going on inside the physical process. And I think that's true for psychedelic experiences too. We need to develop a more sophisticated ontology, metaphysical understanding, even to have a framework for understanding some of these experiences. And this is why I didn't rush into print on any of these experiences. I mean, after I stopped my work in 99, I really spent 20 years digesting them, analyzing, looking at other people's experiences, looking at the other metaphysical systems, and trying to put all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together before I published LSD and the Mind of the Universe. So a lot of thought. It's not simply, here's my experience, you can trust it because I had it. Mm-hmm. It's not that at all. It's really, what we really want is not just one person's experiences, but we want to have a critical protocol which involves many people's experiences, putting all of our experiences on the table and finding out which of these experiences are idiosyncratic and which one of them are common ground. We haven't really begun that work yet. We're in the early stages of doing that, but psychedelics are not going to go away. We're going to be using them for decades and hundreds of years to come. And this challenge of collective verification of the visions that emerge in these states is just getting started, is just moving forward.
It sounds like you're suggesting that we need more research in this area, yeah, which can be tricky because of the taboo and the legalities around it. Although it seems that with other studies on psilocybin and other psychedelics, that maybe that's beginning to shift.
I think it is beginning to shift. I think what's happening is psychedelics, the psychedelic community is demonstrating with increasing convincing research that these substances have a tremendous power to heal And that's what's bringing them back into public discussion. We're going to find over time that the same amplifying qualities which allow them to have a therapeutic impact if we continue to apply these methodologies, they continue to open up deeper and deeper levels of consciousness. And when we get deep enough, eventually we'll begin to harvest the philosophical and cosmological significance of these substances. I gave a talk at the Erotis Conference at Oxford last fall, and I called it Seizing the Philosophical and Cosmological Significance of Psychedelics. We're not there yet, but I think we're going there. We will get there to move in this direction.
Well, Chris, I know this is a very large topic, and I just want to ask this last question, and I'm excited we're going to have another conversation. Is there anything you want to share more today about psychedelics and the cosmic mind?
I want to return again to the cautionary words that we shared in the very beginning. This is deep, challenging, demanding work. You do not try to climb Mount Everest unless you have all the best equipment and all the best guides going with you. You do not want to go deep into the psyche unless you have all the best equipment and the best context for doing this type of work. So I want to affirm that. I want to affirm the importance of a rigorous protocol. If you want to go deep, you have to have a particularly rigorous protocol, first just to survive the encounter, but also to take experiences and distill them into increasingly clear, articulate experiences that are not lost into, that your mind just doesn't swallow them up. You can really bring back the core of the experience. Once you do that, once you've taken all the cautions, all the precautions, and once you have spent time doing your due diligence in this, then I think we are at the cusp of a completely new chapter in philosophy of consciousness, a new chapter in our understanding what is happening in existence. Why is human existence the way it is? Why is existence the way it is? What's going on underneath the surface? What is the nature of the intelligence that's manifesting the body of the universe? What is the nature of the intelligence that's manifesting inside our own hearts and mind over time? This, I think, is the beginning of a whole new chapter of philosophical and spiritual reflection. In conclusion, I just would want to leave with your viewers a sense of excitement for this tremendous turning point that we are at, this pivot point of this profound deepening of our understanding, of our experience of these deep structures of reality, and a deepening of our understanding of what's taking place behind the scenes, and the opportunity to enter into conscious communion with the source of our existence, which was previously maybe just the privileged domain of very, very advanced meditative and contemplative mystics. But now we have a new modality that allows even ordinary human beings to have just a touch, a taste of these experiences, which can be life-changing.
And for people to know the risks and the benefits, right? Because each person might have a different reaction or response to these kinds of substances. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there are screening criteria and more criteria that which are used in order to make sure people who do this work are safe, and only people who should do this work do this work.
Chris Bache, thank you so much for being with me today. Thank you so much for going beyond the beyond and bringing it back for all of us. I really have enjoyed our conversation, and I look forward to our next one.
Thank you, Remy. I have enjoyed our conversation too. Thank you for the work you're doing. We need all the wisdom we can get in the years ahead.
Yes. And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here. 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org